Hello, so this is the fourth video lecture, the chapter of middle childhood. And I left off on the third lecture talking about the psychometric approaches, so various tests of intelligence and IQ. In this video lecture, I'm going to talk about a couple other cognitive topics, specifically language development, language and literacy development, and then maybe move on to talk about how kids do in school during the during middle childhood. Okay, so what we have on this slide is some terms. So going back a couple chapters when we were talking about Chomsky and Chomsky's theory that we had a language acquisition device in our brain and we were naturally programmed to learn language, and then but in linguistics, the ability to read is the symbolic interpretation of language. So what we start to see with school-age kids here is we start to see their understanding of a simile, of metaphor, of syntax, this fancy term for the pragmatics of language. In other words, when you get to middle school, a kid is starting to master the ability, like conversational skills, storytelling skills. If you've ever hung out with small children and you've observed how they like kind of talk incessantly and don't know how to take turns, we start to see some of that shift when you get to first grade, second grade, and a kid should to middle school and know about how to take turns in conversations. If they don't, like for instance, my son who on the spectrum, he doesn't understand the rules of, well, he does now, but when he was small, he didn't get the same age that his peers were, that you talk, then I talk. That's what we mean by pragmatics, is the social context of language. And then, how to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. There's a discussion in your textbook here about different approaches to second language development. And there are 3 different methods for teaching second language learners. So this would be, what I mean by a second language learner is someone who is learning English potentially for, after they know Spanish or Hebrew or whatever. So you have something called an English immersion approach, which is the most common, the most typical approach. And this is what we might typically call an ESL. So this is you take a child who doesn't speak English, you put them in a separate classroom, and you only talk English, and you only use English to them. And the idea is that they'll eventually learn English, which apparently they do, but this is not as effective as, according to your textbook, this is not as effective as another approach, which is referred to as bilingual education. And in bilingual education, a child would be in an English-only classroom. They would be in a class and get instruction in that classroom, and then they would be in their native language classroom. And so they would basically be getting like dual instruction in 2 different languages. And your textbook suggests that their children actually perform better in these bilingual educational settings. And then you have something called a 2-way or a dual language learning. And that is where children who are both English speakers and non-English speakers are in the classroom, and they get instructions, say in English as well as in a native language. So that would be good for both the child who's learning English for the first time and the child who's learning another language. And they say very, very few schools actually do it this way. Most of them do the English immersion, which is not the most effective. The most effective is bilingual. The least common is this 2-way. Okay, so next further down here, we've got some terms associated with how a child, like literacy terms. So, and they refer to, strategies for learning language. So I learned, and I learned a system called decoding, and decoding is where we learned. So I hadn't considered this before I started teaching this stuff, but think about it like this. A child is learning when they use decoding. They have to learn to recognize that these shapes are letters. So they have to learn, that when a squiggly goes like this, it's a letter A. Then they have to learn what the sound is associated with the letter A. Then they have to learn that when an A is, say, in a certain part of the word, it sounds like A, and when another part of the word, it sounds like at. That is really a very sophisticated cognitive process. Decoding, while it may be slow, according to your textbook, it is the most effective way to learn language. For a period, it was that's the way I learned, was the process of decoding. But another approach, something called a code emphasis. Oh, so code emphasis is when that's still today, when I don't know a word, I emphasize it with phonetics, right? I sound it out. There was a period where this was seen as sort of old school, and some schools were using something called a whole language approach. The whole language approach, and this is important, the whole language approach is based on Chomsky's theory, Chomsky's theory or Chomsky's observation that we don't have to teach a child, going back to the chapter where we were talking about language acquisition, and we didn't have to teach a child grammar, but they just learned grammar, right? So again, it's that language acquisition device. The whole language approach theorizes that a child can learn to read like that too. Apparently, the data does not support that theory. The data supports that that children will learn, that it's easier for a child to learn how to read if they use a combination of decoding, and it's the ones that have the asterisks on here, and visual-based retrieval, otherwise known as sight words. You remember having to learn sight words, or maybe having to teach your kid? So that's a fancy, sight words is a simple word for the visual-based retrieval is a fancy word for sight words, right? You can, throw that around at parent-teacher conferences. Anyway, the point is that these are different approaches to learning language, and while decoding or the phonetic approach is linguistically laborious, in other words, it's sort of a drawn-out process, it does appear to be more effective, right? The children learn to read better that way than this whole language approach. Metacognition. Metacognition is just a fancy term for children's ability to think about thinking. That metacognition is a cognitive development where a child can understand, is cognitively aware that of thoughts, right? I know it sounds sounds really abstract, but it's sort of like when we were talking about the self, that it takes a certain ability of cognitive understanding for a child to even realize that they have thoughts. And when a child has metacognition, right, when they have developed this capacity, they can say, I don't understand. They have enough understanding of the concept of understanding that they can explain that they don't understand. Okay. So what do we got on this slide here? We have some of the research about what is important for a child, a school-age kid, middle childhood, 1st through 6th grade, to be successful in school. We refer to Bronfenbrenner here. He's the fellow that had that contextual theory, and he observed that the idea that development is dependent upon all of those other relationships, right? So a child, the success of a child in school is not just dependent upon how they do in that particular place in the classroom, but because Bronfenbrenner's theory, because a child has relationships to other spheres, to relationships to other social ecosystems, like they have a home life. Their home life might influence how well they do in school. Their parents' job might influence their home life, and their home life will influence how they do in school. The economy or the city that they live in will influence if their parents have a job, what kind of job they have, what hours they work, which will then influence their home life, which will predict, do they get a good night's sleep? Are they well fed? Do they feel safe? Do they have clean clothes? And then when they go to school, it will influence how well they do in school. So the point is how a child does in school is not just a outcome of the school itself or that relationship, but there's all these other layers that influence. Now, some of the things that research does support, or that we can specifically identify, we can identify this concept of self-efficacy. I think that term comes up in another chapter. Self-efficacy simply refers to if a child feels, or if a person, we all have self-efficacy. If you feel like you can affect your environment, you yourself can affect what happens to you. Kids that have this sense of, it's a form of control, it's a locus, the location of one's control, will do better if they feel like the world doesn't just happen to them, that they can affect what happens to them. If they can follow the rules, they'll get positive reinforcement. Girls appear to do a little bit better. Parenting style seems to predict how a kid does better, specifically a parenting style that is based on that high responses, right? High demands, high responses. So a child who is in a home where their parents have expectations and then they follow through on those expectations, and it's not just consequences, right? And will do better. And then the job that their parents do. So if a parent has a job where, say, they work at a desk and they have a computer and they bring papers home and they read books, that will be easier for a child than if a child never sees their parents looking at books. Social capital. So this is a social science term that refers to your networks of support, right? We know that if parents have someone to support them, it will be easier for the parent to support their kid. I mean, it's not, maybe you had the experience, you brought home your homework and your parents couldn't help you with the homework. What do your parents do? Do they have someone else they can call? Do they have someone that can watch you while they go to work? That makes it, so social capital speaks to sort of Bronfenbringer's theory about, the different layers. Peer acceptance, right? If you have friends, this speaks to Maslow's hierarchy, which I don't think I've talked too much about yet this semester. But if a kid goes to school and they're feeling scared and lonely, it will be less likely that they focus on their schoolwork because that's a lower level of need, Maslow's hierarchy. No Child Left Behind is simply when schools are punished and it's all about the test, right? And schools are, when the system holds schools accountable by withdrawing the funds when they don't perform well, right? It's not proven to be, students' test scores have in fact improved, but there's an awful lot of evidence that says that students aren't learning anymore. It's just the test scores have gotten better because now we teach the test. It's all about the grades. It's not about the learning. Of course, we know class size matters, right? The larger the class size, the less one-on-one attention, the easier it is for kids to fall through the cracks. School safety, is a kid coming to school worried about, do they have to do active shooter drills or is it a safe place? And then your textbook talks about the use of media, specifically like how much a child spends staring at a tablet. I'm electing not to talk about that right now, not because, prior to COVID, we were telling kids not to stare at a screen more than 4 hours. Now in COVID, we're telling our school-age kids to sit in front of a screen for 6 hours. So I don't think that any of that data is gonna bear itself out. Okay, I'm gonna stop here, and in the next lecture, I want to talk about special education needs for children in school. Okay, I can figure out how to stop it.